So I looked up, and it was my dad looking down at me, and my dad said,
Michel, if you come back home late today, I will punish you.
That is my dad's voice. But my dad told me, be back home before 6 p.m. So I looked up at my dad and I said, Dad, I promise I'll be back home before 6 p.m. And so I ran to school, and halfway to school I met my best friend Kevin, who was 12 and I was 5. Now the only reason why Kevin was older than me was because as a 5-year-old kid, I was a little bit of a troublemaker. And every time my parents told me to do one thing I said, again, I did the opposite of what they told me. So I went to school with Kevin, and at that time Kevin was older than me, and as a troublemaker I used to get in a lot of fights, and sometimes with kids who were older than me. So I made friends with Kevin so he'd fight for me, and I'd watch him fight. And that was the only reason why Kevin and I were friends. And so we went to math class, and the teacher was teaching 1 + 1 = 2, and I wasn't really good at math, so that day I didn't really pay attention to my teacher. Instead I was making spitballs and I was throwing at all the kids in the front, and then I'd hide behind my desk so they wouldn't see me. Now at the end of the day, the bell rang and all the kids were running back home. And at 5 years old, I sat on my desk and I started to weigh my options. And I kept thinking to myself, should I go home and be Daddy's little good boy like I promised him, be home before 6 p.m., or go to the soccer field, play soccer, and have fun instead? And at 5 years old, I made a choice that I'm sure a lot of people would have made in this room. I looked at the front door of my school, and instead of running home to be Daddy's little good boy like I'd promised him, I ran straight to the soccer field to go play soccer with Kevin. As I got in the soccer field, Kevin passed me the ball, and I shot it into the roof of the net. It was the best goal I'd ever scored, so naturally I started running around the field screaming, "Goal!" But as I was running around, I saw these army trucks. And 2 of them were racing right across the field that we were playing soccer. And so I looked at Kevin and I asked him why these soldiers were coming here. And Kevin looked down at me and he said, they're probably coming to watch me play soccer, so don't pay attention to them. Now because Kevin was older than me, I thought that, yeah, they're probably coming to watch him play. So I turned around to go kick the ball back into the net. But as I was turning around, I heard a gunshot going off in the background. And I looked across the field, and I saw one of my friends dropping to the ground. Now at first I didn't really think much of it. I thought that he was doing exactly what we were told when we were kids, which was when you hear a gunshot, you always drop to the ground. But eventually I found out later that my friend was shot and killed. But as I laid there in this huge field of grass, I remember not hearing anything else other than the sound of my own heartbeat. Then in front of me I heard a voice say, "Get up!" And so I got up and I started looking around the field, just trying to see what was going on. But every time I looked around, I looked at all my friends and they had tears coming down their face. I looked at the rebel soldiers and I didn't understand why they were coming to this field in the first place. And the only thing at that time as a troublemaker, I started to think, and the one thing that I could think about or try to rationalize this was that my father had hired these soldiers to make sure we understood why we needed to be home before 6 p.m. So as a troublemaker that I was, thinking this is a joke, I took a deep breath and I ran towards one of the rebel commanders and I kept yelling at him to let me go home, and every time I'd yell, he just kept laughing at me. Then one of the rebel soldiers came up with an AK-47 and they hit me in the head and I passed out. The next thing that I remember is just waking up in a truck and we're driving on this bumpy road. And as I looked around the truck, as I started to wake up and get consciousness, I just noticed there were these soldiers with AK-47 on the front of the truck, and we weren't allowed to get out. And so I started looking around the room as I panicked, trying to find where Kevin was, and I couldn't see him, nor could I even talk to him. And eventually, after driving for so long, the trucks eventually stopped, and we were told to get out. Now, the typical troublemaker that I was, I remember being the first person to jump out of the truck, thinking that maybe I could run home after that. But the first step I took out of the truck, I remember hearing a crunch underneath my feet. And so I looked in the ground, and there was a skeleton. And as I looked across the fields, there were hundreds and hundreds of skeletons with no skulls. And again, I felt so terrified that I ran over to the commander and I begged him to let me go home. And I remember telling him that if he didn't let me go home, that my father was going to come there and he was going to punish me and them for not being home before 6 p.m. But he just kept on laughing at me. Then they gathered all the kids and they put us into a circle, and one of the rebel commanders came up and he stood in front of us and he said, We are going to initiate you into our army. So they grabbed my left arm. They grabbed a knife and they slashed my wrist. As I started to bleed, they took a substance called brown, which is a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder, and they rubbed this into the wound so I'd go crazy. Then they started turning me against all the children, and they came up with a blindfold, and they blindfolded me. Then they told me to put my hands out, and as I did, they dropped an AK-47 in my hand. But the gun was so heavy I couldn't lift it, I just dropped it on the ground. The same rebel soldier came behind me, he picked up the AK-47, he grabbed my finger and he put it on the trigger, and he started yelling at me, "Shoot! Shoot!" So I pulled the trigger. My hands shook and I dropped the gun on the ground. The same rebel soldier came behind me and he took off the blindfold, and as I looked at my right hand, he was shaking and there's blood dripping from it. And as a kid, I used to love Superman, so I was wearing a white Superman shirt, and as I looked at it, there's blood dripping from it too. I looked a few feet in front of me, and I saw my best friend lying there in a pool of his own blood. At 5 years old, I was forced to kill my best friend as a way of joining an army.